The room felt heavier than silence itself, like the kind of stillness that comes before a storm breaks across the sky. When reporters leaned forward, cameras blinking red, and a single question hung in the air. Why were critical names and documents still locked away months after the Department of Justice promised transparency in the Epstein case? And why did every road leading to those records seem to circle back to the White House, where whispers of a major cover-up had begun growing louder with every passing day, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that no press conference could wash away? Like this video and subscribe my channel, USA Reports. Thanks watching full. For years, the Epstein scandal had existed like a dark shadow stretching across political power, elite society, and global influence. But now that shadow was moving again, stirred by renewed demands for accountability, and at the center of it all stood the Trump-era Department of Justice, accused by critics of selectively releasing information while quietly withholding the most explosive pieces. The names, the financial trails, the sealed testimonies that many believed could expose a network far bigger than one disgraced financier. Supporters of transparency argued that justice delayed was justice denied, that every withheld document deepened public distrust, while defenders within government circles insisted that legal complexities, ongoing reviews, and privacy protections required caution. But to the outside world, it looked like something far more calculated, as if invisible hands were carefully deciding which truths could surface and which ones must remain buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. Behind closed doors, former prosecutors, legal analysts, and political insiders began painting a picture of an institution torn between doing what was legally correct and protecting powerful interests that might be implicated if the full scope of Epstein's connections ever saw daylight, raising uncomfortable questions about whether the DOJ was acting independently or under quiet political pressure that never appeared in official memos but was felt in every delayed release. The Trump administration had long promoted a narrative of fighting corruption and draining the swamp, yet this case, more than any other, tested whether that promise extended to those with wealth, status, and proximity to power. Because Epstein's world wasn't made up of small-time criminals, it was filled with billionaires, politicians, royalty, and influencers whose reputations alone could shake governments if officially tied to criminal wrongdoing. Public outrage surged across social media platforms where hashtags demanding full disclosure trended for days, and families of victims gave emotional interviews describing how closure felt impossible when so much evidence remained hidden, their voices shaking not just with grief but with frustration that the system designed to protect them seemed more focused on protecting secrets instead. And as the pressure mounted, one unsettling idea began taking root in the national conversation. What if the biggest scandal wasn't Epstein's crimes themselves, but the coordinated effort afterward to control the narrative, to decide who faced consequences and who quietly walked away untouched, their names erased from public record before anyone could ever connect the dots? Part 2, legal experts started dissecting every DOJ statement with surgical precision, pointing out the careful wording, the vague timelines, the repeated promises of ongoing review, which sounded professional on paper but offered no real explanation for why key files remained classified or sealed long after similar cases had released comparable information, fueling suspicion that the delays were strategic rather than procedural. Some insiders suggested that the documents contained sensitive national security references, while others hinted at high-profile political figures whose involvement, even if indirect, could trigger massive public fallout. And this conflicting reasoning only deepened confusion. Because if the material was dangerous enough to hide, then wasn't it important enough for the public to know? Meanwhile, congressional figures began calling for formal investigations into whether the DOJ had violated transparency obligations, demanding hearings where officials would have to explain under oath why certain evidence was being withheld, turning what started as a criminal case into a political battleground over trust, accountability, and the limits of executive power. News outlets published timelines showing how evidence moved slowly through legal channels, sometimes stalling without explanation, sometimes resurfacing with heavy redactions that removed entire pages of information, leaving readers staring at black bars where crucial details should have been, like a mystery novel where every major clue had been erased. Critics accused the Trump administration of quietly shielding individuals who may have donated to campaigns, supported political agendas, or maintained relationships within elite circles, arguing that corruption doesn't always look like suitcases of cash. Sometimes it looks like paperwork that never gets released and questions that never get answered. Supporters pushed back fiercely, claiming the accusations were politically motivated attacks designed to tarnish the administration's reputation. emphasizing that investigations take time and that rushing disclosures could harm victims or compromise legal processes, creating a divided public where one side saw conspiracy and the other saw caution. But what neither side could ignore was the growing sense that the Epstein case had evolved into something far larger than one man's crimes. It had become a symbol of whether powerful institutions truly hold everyone accountable or whether justice bends quietly when the names involved carry too much influence. Part 3. Behind the scenes, journalists chased anonymous tips from former employees, court clerks, and law enforcement officials who claimed certain files were intentionally flagged for restricted access, requiring higher-level approval that rarely came, suggesting a bottleneck designed to slow any meaningful transparency without outright denying it. Some reporters described meeting sources in parking garages, coffee shops, and encrypted chat rooms where whispers painted a picture of quiet pressure, not direct orders, but subtle reminders about careers, promotions, and reputations that could be affected by how aggressively one pushed for document release. Victim advocates spoke publicly about how the delays reopened wounds, saying every headline about withheld evidence felt like another reminder that powerful abusers often escape full accountability and that the system seemed more concerned with controlling damage than delivering justice. Analysts began comparing the Epstein document controversy to past political scandals where crucial information surfaced years later, revealing that early denials and delays were often tactics to let public interest fade before explosive truths finally emerged when they could no longer cause immediate damage. The White House, when asked directly, deflected responsibility back to the DOJ, insisting the department operated independently, while DOJ spokespeople maintained that legal protocol guided every decision, creating a circular blame game that answered nothing and satisfied no one. Meanwhile, public trust in institutions continued to erode, with polls showing increasing skepticism toward government transparency, especially among younger audiences who consume the unfolding drama in real time across social media, dissecting every update like a true crime series where the ending still hadn't arrived. And with each passing week without new disclosures, the idea of a coordinated cover-up stopped sounding like fringe speculation and started feeling like a legitimate question many Americans believe deserves serious investigation rather than dismissal. Part 4. Political commentators framed the situation as a defining test of the Trump administration's legacy on justice and accountability, arguing that how this case was handled would be remembered long after speeches and policy debates faded from headlines. Some suggested that even if no direct wrongdoing occurred within the DOJ, the perception of secrecy alone had caused irreparable damage, because democracy depends not only on fair processes, but on public confidence that those processes aren't manipulated behind closed doors. Former prosecutors explained that while certain redactions are standard, the scale of withheld information in this case was unusual, especially given the intense public interest and the DOJ's previous statements about prioritizing transparency. Others warned against jumping to conclusions, reminding audiences that complex investigations involving multiple jurisdictions and high-profile individuals can take years to fully unravel, and that premature disclosures could undermine future prosecutions. But the tension remained: transparency versus protection, justice versus stability, truth versus potential chaos, and every withheld document seemed to tilt the balance further toward suspicion. Media coverage intensified, with nightly segments dedicated to analyzing what might be hidden, replaying old interviews, resurfacing connections, and highlighting inconsistencies in official timelines, transforming the Epstein files into one of the most scrutinized document controversies in modern political history. It wasn't just about what was missing anymore. It was about why it was missing, and who ultimately benefited from its absence. Part 5. As the story continues unfolding, one thing has become clear. The Epstein case is no longer just a legal matter. It's a mirror reflecting the public's deepest fears about power, secrecy, and whether truth can survive inside systems built by those who benefit most from controlling it. Whether the withheld documents are eventually released or remain locked away for years, the damage to trust has already been done, because millions now believe that something significant is being hidden. And once that belief takes hold, no official statement can easily erase it. The Trump-era DOJ may insist its actions followed legal protocol, but history has shown time and again that legality doesn't always equal morality, and that many of the biggest scandals only become clear long after those in power have moved on. What haunts this controversy isn't just the unanswered questions. It's the pattern of silence, delay, and deflection that feels eerily familiar to anyone who has watched past cover-ups slowly unravel. If the full truth eventually emerges, it could reshape reputations, political narratives, and public understanding of how deep Epstein's network truly ran. But if it doesn't, it will remain one of those dark chapters where suspicion forever fills the space where facts should have been. In the end, this isn't about one administration, one department, or one scandal. It's about whether justice applies equally to all, or whether it quietly stops at the doors of wealth and power. And that's the question every viewer should be asking, discussing, and demanding answers to. Because when truth is delayed, it isn't just hidden, it's slowly erased. And once erased, it becomes almost impossible to ever fully recover. The deeper investigators dug into archived court filings and sealed testimonies, the clearer it became that Epstein's case wasn't handled like an ordinary criminal prosecution, because time after time critical hearings were postponed, motions disappeared into legal limbo, and key witnesses were quietly negotiated into confidentiality agreements that limited what they could ever publicly say, creating an invisible wall between the truth and the public eye that felt less like legal procedure and more like strategic containment. Former federal agents began hinting in interviews that the sheer volume of digital evidence, emails, travel logs, financial transfers, surveillance footage was far larger than what had ever been acknowledged publicly, suggesting that what the DOJ released might represent only a carefully curated fraction of the total record, while the rest remained stored away under layers of classification that few outside top circles could access. Political pressure intensified as lawmakers demanded to know whether any current or former government officials appeared in those withheld documents, because if true, it could explain the extraordinary cautions surrounding their release, transforming the case from a criminal investigation into a potential constitutional crisis involving abuse of power and obstruction of transparency. Behind the cameras, DOJ officials reportedly clashed internally, with some pushing for broader disclosure to restore public trust, while others warned that releasing certain names without final convictions could trigger massive lawsuits and political backlash, revealing a department torn between legal safety and moral responsibility. Media analysts began mapping Epstein's known associations onto political timelines, highlighting moments when investigations stalled during sensitive political seasons, fueling speculation that strategic delays were designed to minimize electoral damage rather than serve justice. Victims' lawyers filed repeated motions demanding access to sealed evidence, arguing that without full transparency, their clients could never truly confront the system that failed them, while courts responded slowly, often citing procedural technicalities that felt increasingly hollow to a watching public. And with every delay, the narrative hardened. Not just that information was being withheld, but that the withholding itself had become part of a larger system designed to protect the powerful from accountability. As pressure mounted both inside Washington and across the public sphere, whispers began circulating that some of the withheld Epstein documents had been reviewed not just by career prosecutors, but by political appointees whose loyalty lay more with the administration than with long-standing DOJ traditions. A revelation that, if true, would suggest the investigation crossed from legal territory into political strategy, where damage control mattered more than disclosure. Several former Justice Department veterans broke their silence, explaining that in normal high-profile cases, sensitive names might be temporarily redacted, but the sweeping and prolonged secrecy surrounding this investigation was highly unusual, hinting that what lay beneath the blacked-out pages could implicate individuals so influential that releasing their identities could shake institutions to their core. Behind the scenes, powerful lobbying groups were reportedly monitoring every development closely, aware that a single leaked document could trigger lawsuits, resignations, and even international diplomatic fallout, since Epstein's network wasn't confined to one country, but spanned continents and elite circles across the globe. Journalists uncovered financial trails linking shell companies and offshore accounts that flowed around the same timelines as Epstein's travel records, painting a disturbing picture of a well-funded operation that required more than one man's resources manages to sustain, raising questions about who helped bankroll and protect the system for years. Public hearings were proposed, then quietly delayed, then restructured in ways that limited what witnesses could say under oath, frustrating lawmakers who believed full transparency was being intentionally stalled until public attention eventually shifted elsewhere. On social media, independent researchers compiled timelines, leaked court snippets, and public records into massive online threads that went viral, connecting dots the official investigations hadn't publicly acknowledged, and in doing so, keeping the story alive despite institutional silence. The case had now transformed into something resembling a modern political thriller, where every delay felt like a plot twist, every redacted page like a hidden secret, and every official statement like a carefully rehearsed line designed to calm a public that no longer trusted the script. By now, the Epstein controversy had reached a boiling point where even neutral observers found it difficult to believe that so much information could remain hidden without deliberate coordination. Because the longer the documents stayed sealed, the more it appeared that someone, somewhere, was actively managing what the public was allowed to know, turning transparency into a controlled drip rather than a full release. Former intelligence analysts began weighing in, suggesting that certain evidence may have intersected with sensitive operations or high-level surveillance programs, which could explain the government's extreme caution. But critics argued this explanation conveniently masked what was really happening, drama, protection of reputations under the cover of national security language. Inside courtrooms, judges faced increasing pressure from both sides, with victim representatives demanding disclosure in the name of justice, while government attorneys emphasized risks of misinformation, defamation, and compromised investigations, creating tense legal standoffs that often ended with further postponements rather than clear resolutions. Political opponents seized on the controversy as proof of systemic corruption, while allies of the administration warned against weaponizing tragedy for political gain, turning the Epstein files into a partisan battlefield where every development was interpreted through ideological lenses. Meanwhile, investigative documentaries, podcasts, and long-form exposés surged in popularity, each promising to uncover the truth behind the sealed records, keeping public interest alive and amplifying pressure on institutions that seemed determined to stay silent. International media outlets also picked up the story, pointing out how Epstein's connections spanned powerful figures worldwide, suggesting that the withholding of documents in the U.S. might only be one piece of a much larger global effort to contain fallout. The longer this secrecy persisted, the more the narrative shifted from questioning Epstein's crimes to questioning the integrity of the systems meant to expose them, making the cover-up allegations feel less like speculation and more like a logical conclusion many were beginning to accept. Rumors of an internal leak began circulating through Washington like wildfire, with whispers that a small group of officials had grown tired of watching evidence sit locked away while public trust collapsed, and that at least one individual was preparing to release portions of the withheld material to independent journalists if official channels continued to stall. Newsrooms quietly prepared for what could become one of the biggest document drops in modern political history, assembling legal teams and investigative units to verify any potential disclosures, knowing that even a fraction of the sealed records could reshape public understanding of the Epstein network and ignite massive political fallout. At the same time, government cybersecurity divisions reportedly heightened monitoring for unauthorized access attempts, signaling that authorities feared sensitive files might escape controlled systems, further reinforcing the idea that what was being protected was far more explosive than anything already revealed. Public frustration reached a new peak as protests demanding transparency formed outside government buildings, with demonstrators holding signs accusing officials of protecting elites and silencing victims, turning the controversy from an online debate into a visible movement on the streets. Political leaders who once remained cautious began shifting tone, calling openly for full disclosure and warning that continued secrecy could permanently damage democratic institutions, a rare moment of bipartisan concern in an era usually defined by division. Legal analysts predicted that if leaked information surfaced proving intentional suppression, it could lead to investigations not just into Epstein's associates, but into DOJ conduct itself, potentially resulting in resignations, criminal inquiries, and sweeping reforms. And hanging over it all was one chilling possibility, that the longer the truth stayed hidden, the more dangerous its eventual release would become, because suppressed secrets have a way of erupting with far greater force than those faced openly. International media outlets also picked up the story, pointing out how Epstein's connections spanned powerful figures worldwide, suggesting that the withholding of documents in the U.S. might only be one piece of a much larger global effort to contain fallout. The longer this secrecy persisted, the more the narrative shifted from questioning Epstein's crimes to questioning the integrity of the systems meant to expose them, making the cover-up allegations feel less like speculation and more like a logical conclusion many were beginning to accept.